I'm gratified to see so many colleagues and fellow companions who've traveled with me on a personal and professional journey that's lasted over 40 years. My profound gratitude to those who honor the efforts of myself and others who preserve and share the history of our state, while celebrating the contributions of Iowans to the nation's growth and character. We have worked together to preserve Iowa's photographic history by collecting remarkable specimens that tell amazing stories, and by developing a deeper scholarly appreciation for the talents of the artists who created this visual documentation. Please take the time to visit the Faces of Iowa exhibition on the first floor, especially the Treasures Within box, the little black vitrine with black cloth over it, because it displays rare images like the 1850s ambrotype of the Powell block in Iowa City. Or later, for 2 weeks in April, you'll be able to see Isaac Wetherby's original daguerreotype of Old Capitol. The examples you will see tonight only hint at what is waiting to be explored if you are curious about the images, people, and methods that comprise Iowa's photographic history. We're only 3 blocks away. I'm grateful for this opportunity to publicly acknowledge many of the people who inspire me or insist in the achievements I receive credit for. A key stroke of good luck in my young life came in 1972 when I met Bob Birchfield, an incredibly patient man who protects and grounds me. My friends know I would be lost without him. Our conversations about history, like those I had with my father, Norman Bennett, become constant reminders of the continuous threads that hold generations of humanity together. My father was a self-taught historian, often found immersed in popular books or back issues of American heritage, but he came alive when visiting historical sites or reading the landscape. A great storyteller, he taught me that history is not always found in books, but can be experienced with other senses. Paramount among these was a sense of place, hence my Iowa pride, and don't get me started about Sioux City. Reality can hit you in the face when you stand on the same spot where an event occurred, or inner sites where people lived. He fired up my imagination at every turn, pointing out the clues and helping me interpret the scene and complexities of history. He readily identified the human pathos in every story and surprised me with the depth of his knowledge. I thank him for these gifts. Historically, photography, invented in 1839, has proven it has the power to change the world, perhaps as the premier technological advancement of the past 2 centuries in terms of its impact on every aspect of our lives, from communication and education to medicine and scientific research. Exploding on the scene at exactly the same time Iowa became a state, the ability to document through imagery was revolutionary. Photography began in a relatively primitive manner, rapidly morphed into more lifelike moving images, and now pervades our society in previously unimagined ways. Our minds are ingrained with famous photographs or footage that shocked the world or left indelible marks on human consciousness. Within this very broad spectrum of visual documentation from the past, we find a magnificent portrait of our own humble state, created by hundreds of camera operators and now residing at the State Historical Society of Iowa, where it has been preserved for your use. Thousands of specimens, prints, negatives, slides, etc., survive as evidence of the work of these individual photographers who generated a collective point of view on the experience of living in our state for over 175 years. These pre-electronic age images represent important perspectives on the Midwest and therefore America as a whole, offering fresh ideas on how distinctive Iowa is, while reminding us of the commonalities we share with others in our region and state. The pantheon of Iowa photographers we honor tonight deserve national notoriety for their contributions towards understanding American history as they create an incomparable visual record of life in this state. We are accustomed to looking at photography within a cultural historical framework, as artifact and as documentary evidence. I'd like to speak about the value of vernacular photography as sources of artistic inspiration and as reservoirs of historical memory. Each image has a story to tell, created to foster an understanding of someone's life experience. Photographers of the Midwest, both men and women, working as professionals and amateurs, made substantial contributions to our culture, and not only to the field of photography. As it turns out, their artistic impressions now have value to social historians, anthropologists, novelists, filmmakers, and a variety of scholars and laypersons. Photographs can be emotionally charged documents, which reflect the motivations of the photographer or record the singular passions of the subject. Pictures demonstrate how one person sees the world, where they were willing to go, who they mingled with, what they could afford, and what they were curious about, all the while attempting to meet artistic and complicated technical challenges to capture quality images. To have each person's vision preserved on film and saved for future generations is a rare and fabulous resource for learning and enjoyment. We can literally retrace the steps of our ancestors to discover things heretofore unknown or forgotten. Fostering an intersection of history and memory is one of the key roles photography plays in our life. Powerful invocation of memory and emotion is at the heart of the most superb images. They can provide an immediate connection to the past, whether or not we shared the experience. We search for ourselves or people we might have known. Or somehow our imagination allows us to feel related because they shared similar cultural experiences, such as the phenomenon of children at a slumber party, or people engaged in political activism. Nostalgia plays a part in our enthusiastic response to some photos, but we are also responding to the humanity portrayed in such an accepting and casual manner. Other photos convey a less sentimental or romanticized ideal and point out the disparities in our society or the excitement people feel when empowered to strike out and challenge the status quo. Regardless of the emotional appeal of an image, those evaluating visual documentation apply consistently high standards of criticism to judge and potentially accept any proof or truth conveyed in the image. Determining the veracity of an image depends on careful analysis of the method, means, and motivations behind the creation, as well as studying the content in conjunction with other forms of supporting evidence. Commenting on photographs as documents, historian Robert M. Levine writes, quote, "A photograph becomes a historical document when it suggests ways to examine people's lives or when it captures the texture of daily life. Obviously, it is one thing to extract material evidence from a photograph and very much another to attempt to extract emotional, psychological, or personal inferences from mute images for which we lack supplementary data. These things become a bit easier when the facts of a photograph are linked with others to form a pattern that is understandable and credible," unquote. We approach photos with subjective points of view shaped by legends, myth, misunderstandings perpetuated by popular culture or inadequate teachings. Historians have the responsibility and necessary scholarly rigor to extract the facts before analyzing the content and variety of photographs, regardless of the era or technology used to create them. Newspapers, memoirs, diaries, maps, oral histories, and other sources may offer descriptions or impressions that are validated or proven by photographic evidence. Photography heralded for its realistic mechanical viewpoint contains a contradictory element. For the camera could create illusions. Photography is at once both subjective and objective. Objective in the sense that it perfectly replicates the scene before it, but subjective because the photographer controlled the image by selecting the subject matter to record. The photographers could alter a composition or frame the subject in such a way to create an emotional human response or stage an activity for illustration. In expressing a personal vision of the world, the bias of the photographer and the relationship to the subject portrayed is of primary importance in determining the outcome of the image. There's kind of insiders and outsiders. Our example being of Pete Weddick, who was kind of an insider in his community when he took those photographs. The historical imagination needs to be nurtured, and photography remains a powerful force for doing so. Academia, documentary film producers, publishers, and patrons of the art and the general public should avoid dismissing photographs as simply adjunct pieces of information or forms of illustration. Historical studies and public engagement in the humanities can benefit from a higher regard for these primary sources, offering a window into the past lives, as well as the corollary examples of human behavior over time. Photographs seem to face the same battle for acceptance and legitimacy among traditional historians as they once faced in the art world. As scholar Nara Pavarti wrote, quote, "When photography was first invented in the 19th century, it was hailed as a revolution in humans' relationship with time and place." She continued, quote, "More to the point, the visual has become a key instrument in mediating the world around us. It is as vital as language itself and equally potent in symbolic significance." As esteemed University of Iowa scholar Ed Folsom, an expert on Walt Whitman and 19th century America, wrote in an essay, quote, "The power of photography," Whitman said, "was in its," quote from Whitman, "knack of catching life on the run, in the flash, as it shifted, moved, evolved." So there's a debate about whether photography is the ultimate tool for promoting democracy. And that debate's gone on since its infant days when it was concentrated in Europe and America. Another writer, Lewis Bush, says, "Of course photography isn't innately democratic, but it has democratic potential, which is increasingly being realized by the proliferation of new technologies that put cameras in even ever larger numbers of hands and provided them with ways to distribute those images. All of our cell phones are now tools of democracy." The framework for understanding the impact begins with the settlement of Iowa and the proliferation of photographers and photography studios, especially along the early river towns, the Mississippi in particular, serving as centers of commerce and connected to larger markets like St. Louis, Cincinnati, or New Orleans. Men and a few women established storefront operations offering daguerreotyped portraits as early as 1846 in Dubuque, Burlington, Keokuk, Muscatine, and elsewhere, the same year Iowa became a state. Initially, photography was embraced by an elite group of wealthy practitioners, usually white males with few exceptions. More often, they were itinerant photographers who would set up in a hotel room or temporary salon. Carte de visite portraits featured a sharply focused full-length portrait that was sold to clients wearing their latest fashion and finery. An advertisement for an early daguerrean gallery in Canesville, which is now Council Bluffs, pronounced, "Whoa, what some power the gifty give us to see ourselves as others see us." Another popular saying was, secure the shadow ere the substance fade. Let nature copy that which nature made." The town photographer expanded his or her trade by taking excursions out in the field, which occurred with greater frequency with the introduction of stereophotography and stereographs. Enthralled with the promise of a bright future and unlimited opportunity, these early photographers were just a segment of a larger group of Iowans fascinated by the lure of life in America's Garden of Eden and a desire to settle the West. The photographers who operated the portrait studios and engaged in landscape photography were regarded as professionals by their peers in the community. Highly skilled and undoubtedly individualistic in nature, the local photographer was an important fixture in town. Some experienced long-term prosperity, as evidenced by fine homes, fancy studios, or by opening branches in nearby villages. Others had only set up temporary residence in town using a portable tent or wagon. Some may even been known as charlatans, or perhaps as some sort of seducers trying to convince customers of their beauty and importance. The universal mania for photography generated a curiosity about the outside world while fostering a sense of identity and pride in one's own home environment. Typically, the categories or subjects found among views of major cities from around the world were very similar to the views that we find of Iowa's towns and cities. This reinforces the notion that photographers practicing in Iowa were responding to a keen public interest in America's growing empire, and in particular the centrality of the Midwest to that experience. These pictorial representations suggest ways that Iowans joined other Americans in the pursuit of economic, intellectual, and emotional well-being, fostered by westward expansion and the growth of industry. Photographers who succeeded as commercial entrepreneurs or the skilled amateurs had a knack for the subject matter that they were taking. Aesthetically pleasing shots would be best, so photographers neglected less desirable aspects of community life. Moreover, they seldom wasted precious negatives on scenes which did not render the best perspective or compositions. Technical factors may have been the overriding influence when a photographer was considering where to point his or her camera. Interior photography depended on a great deal of natural lighting, either from large storefront windows, skylights, on the side or on the roof of the building. On the road, interior photography would have required the burning of flash powder to light a room bright enough for the collodion wet plate to capture the image. Furthermore, the process of photography was too expensive and time-consuming to engage in unless these early 19th century photographers could recoup his or her expenses by selling images. Images are compelling for the insightful ways they suggest or offer proof, yet they sometimes raise unanswered questions. Some are stunningly beautiful, either by accident or by design, and are elevated to works of art due to the quality of composition, control of tonal range, or point of view of the photographer. A batch of photos relating to one topic can provide overall impressions by showing intensive coverage of some ideas and minimal examples of others. I'll just quickly say there's 50,000 images in the Weddick collection with thousands of images of tractors, but only a couple hundred of those show women on tractors. So we get a perspective on what's going on as time changes. Photography documents segments of Iowa history across several generations, and not everything is portrayed or portrayed very often. Minorities, underprivileged, or people who seem unpresentable or unimportant by social convention seldom appear before the camera. Therefore, we lack visual evidence of the experiences or the way they lived. With few exceptions, these images must be in private hands if they've survived at all. Prepared with ingenuity, these visual treasures represent the life's work of several generations of photographers. The images offer broad meanings as they symbolize the hopes and aspirations of Iowans. The photographs place us in the mindset of their reality while documenting frontier idealists or the disappearing natural landscape. 20th century journalists brought attention to issues and events of the day using faster technology and gaining access to unseen worlds close at hand. Although no longer heralded as it once was, silver-based photography revolutionized the cultural, historical, and intellectual nature of the world. Here we use Iowa as the backdrop for examining the apex of this phenomenon. The remnants of this pictorial tradition offer an amazing record of the intricacies of daily life and a direct glimpse at places far away in time. So the boring reading part is over, and now I'm going to ask if Catherine can maybe dim the lights so that we can go through our little images that we have here. If I could darken the room and hypnotize you for a moment, really, I'm not kidding, humor me. Close your eyes. Quiet your mind. Imagine a time before our communication devices came along. Distances seemed greater and mail was slower. No telegraph, no telephone, no radio, no TV, no computer, no cell phone. Far less static, overstimulation, and constant distraction from the tasks at hand. Newspapers, literature, and art might picture the world, but nothing like photography existed. European inventors and artists began a quest to fix an image using mechanical and chemical means, finally achieving results by 1839. Some of us, you know who you are, get so immersed in looking beyond the main subject to peer into the backgrounds, reading the tiny lettering of signs, or studying the faces and demeanor of people. You love to get out your magnifying glasses to delve into the nitty-gritty details, the nuances not apparent with a quick glance. What a boon when viewers can zoom in, way in, to focus attention on every corner of the image, including dark and softly focused areas, to see if anything is revealed. Interpreting the image means dissecting every element present in the shot. We easily get lost in historical images, almost escaping the bounds of our time to travel in some time warp to the past. We often hear glimpses of the past used to describe photography, suggesting a fragment or partial record, something ephemeral. However, the cumulative effect of looking at so many supposedly similar images on a repeated basis actually proves that the potential of photographic documentation requires more than just a glimpse to understand the reality permanently captured on film. Iowa has a clear and cohesive portrait of life and covering many, many topics, geographical locations, and people. There are well over 1 million images in this collection. It is difficult to explain, but Jamie and Paul Some of you who know have spent decades or a lifetime investigating historical photos. You have an inkling of what I'm talking about. This selection of images is by no means a full representation of the collection, and there are far too many examples to share in 1 hour. So please come explore Iowa's visual heritage with me, but come down 3 blocks away and visit me at the State Historical Society. This is really an amazing collection. So you already know this is Wetherby's daguerreotype, and I deliberately reversed it because this is a mirror image and it'd be difficult to see it if it was oriented the way it was actually created. And I'm not going to go into all the technical things about photography because there's books that you can read about that. But this is a very, very important photograph. This is a daguerreotype of the Sac Chief Keokuk. It was made in St. Louis by Thomas M. Easterly in 1847, and the original is actually in the collections of the Missouri Historical Society. But it's probably the first piece of photographic evidence we have that actually is part of our state story. And this is a photograph that shows Frank Shawata, born in 1874, and a man named Young Bear, born in 1867, who were both members of the Musquaki tribe. And of course, they were the people living in this territory when we came along. But this photograph is part of a series that were shot in about 1900, 1905, because Benjamin Shambaugh sent Duran Ward, who was the minister at the Unitarian Church, out on sort of a social history expedition to the Musquaki settlement, and he made these photographs. And so my interest at the State Historical Society of the Musquaki actually harks back to Shambaugh's interest originally in Duran Ward's. And so I had a friend, Bob Campagna, who's an excellent photographer from Mount Vernon and now lives in Colorado. And so I asked him to go out to the Musquaki settlement about 1999 or 2000 to create a comparable set of photographs of the Musquaki. And this is my friend Jonathan Buffalo, who's the tribal historian. And again, one benefit of being in the College of Liberal Arts is you meet really great people. So this is one of my best friends, and it all came because we sat together in the back of a history class. But now I'm going to talk about in the studio, and I have to pay tribute to a lot of people who've made these images possible, and I'll do that as I go along. This is Esther Mendenhall. This is another daguerreotype, very hard to capture because of the mirror-type face on it. She was a local woman. This daguerreotype was on display here at Old Capitol. Let's see, when was she here? Or maybe she's going to be here. But there's a series of these photographs that are going to be as part of the Faces of Iowa exhibit. Many of you who study 19th century photography are familiar with the post-mortem shots because infant mortality rates were so high, and sometimes all they had in terms of a memory of a child they lost was a photograph. And so this one's remarkable because the child's quite lively. But this is an interesting photograph. This is all we know about. This actually comes from the collections in Des Moines. And it's a photo of my favorite slave. Well, just to give you some perspective, a daguerreotype might sell for $1.50 back in 1845, which is equivalent to about $40 today. So they were spending a lot of money to have this woman's portrait taken, even though she remains nameless. But it reminds us that Iowa was a free state, and the settlers who came here had different ideals. There are a few photographers that are connected to Iowa that truly have national significance, and I'm just going to mention 3 of them very quickly. One is John Plum, who had a studio in Washington, D.C. in 1845-46, and he created the first daguerreotypes or the first images of the U.S. Capitol. He actually had lived in Dubuque with his brother Richard prior to that, and ironically, Walt Whitman used to go visit Plum's daguerreotype studio all the time to study the images. The second person I want to mention is Doremus. J.P. Doremus had this fantasy of creating images up and down the Mississippi River, kind of a tour up and down the river. So he had this boat, which you can see had a studio and skylight built into it, and that black object on top is a large camera that was just there probably sort of as an advertising mechanism. And this is something that Paul Jewell is actually an expert on and has collected many of his images, but he was up in Wisconsin as well, and very important photographer for the nation's history, but here he is in Iowa documenting our landscape. And the other person I want to mention very quickly is Samuel Root. And you guys can correct me, but I believe he got his training from Samuel Morris, who was one of the first photographers in the nation. And you might be wondering what's going on in this picture. Well, with wet plate photography, you had to use chemicals on site right immediately before you took the picture and immediately afterwards. So this tent or pole that's got cloth down is his darkroom. So he would have gone to stand in there to pull his plates out so he wouldn't accidentally expose them. Also laying there on the ground with him is his dog, who appears in many, almost all of his images. We used to call him Daguerre, but then we actually found an article, and his name is Dean. This is Isaac Wetherby's studio, which is right here on Clinton Street, and I'm showing you this for a reason. This is an albumin print, which rapidly fades and then therefore loses details. And so having a good environment, a storage environment, and good curators for these collections is paramount importance. And this is because here's like a reproduction that was made about 1910 by his daughter, but we can actually see more of what's going on now that it's not quite so faded. And of course, we can try to enhance these things with computers, but it doesn't always work. Up on the upper right, you'd see there's a shelf outside the window where they could expose some photography plates. There's also a painting, because he's also a portrait painter that he's put out on the outside of his building. And there's all kinds of products on display down underneath the lower part of the storefront. This is Isaac Wetherby. This is again from our collections in Des Moines. I'm only going to show you 3 things from Des Moines tonight, but this is one of them. This is an ambrotype. The next step in the development of photography beyond the daguerreotype was the ambrotype, or the glass plate negative, that allowed you to make multiple prints from one negative. This is actually a negative on glass that you put a black backing behind and it becomes a positive. And it's in this decorative case, as you saw the daguerreotypes were, because they were extremely fragile and they needed to have protection. And Wetherby's quite a character, but all of you in this community know Mary Besloniger's work on that, which actually followed up on Margaret Bonney's work. Margaret Bonney worked at the State Historical Society and identified some important things. But one of my students there I got a part-time job over at the Putnam Museum on a grant we offered, and lucky for me, he decided, or the Putnam Museum decided, that most of Mr. Wetherby's glass plate negatives belonged joined with his collection in Iowa City. But again, go downstairs into the exhibit, because his camera with multiple lenses is down there, and a few other things, including a campaign banner he painted for Abraham Lincoln. This is the interior of Wetherby's studio. Again, these were designed to be like salons. You know, it's like high class, highly educated, sophisticated places, not places where hicks hang out, but where you get all dressed up and come and look at yourself in the mirror. And so we see here he was interested in pictures of Native Americans. On the table there is a stereograph viewing box that would turn to reveal different cards. And this is, as you can see, this is the largest group I have ever taken under a skylight by Wetherby, Iowa City. And so we can see here he's got all kinds of screens and ways he's trying to illuminate that room, because he's got a very slow development or exposure time. And this is Mr. Perkins' Iowa State Academy of Music, which is actually a scholar who happens to be working on that academy right now. And this is the rooftop of Mr. Wetherby's gallery, and these images were printed basically by the sun interacting with the chemicals in the paper. It's called sun printing. And so he's got an enlarger there capturing the light with the man in that opening. That's actually Mrs. Johnson, who's the widow of a Civil War veteran, and she would do a lot of the careful handwork in the studio like women did in those days. And this is just a quick explanation of why it's complicated. If you've heard of Matthew Brady or some of the people that are doing Civil War era shots, they're actually in danger, because they're right there on the edge of the front lines, and they've got a wagon with volatile chemicals in it. They have to get the plate ready and put the liquid emulsion on it, go take the picture, come back, and then process it. That's called wet plate photography. You really had to have a skill set to be able to do that. Here's another studio, again, with a harmonium sit on the right to, again, suggest music and sophistication and elegance. That's a mirror covered with gauze, perhaps to protect it from reflecting the photographer, but also maybe just to keep it clean. This is a studio. Actually, this is, sorry, I lost my track. That last one was DeWitt, Iowa. This is Algona, Iowa. They had to supplement their income, so of course selling frames and albums and things like that was exceedingly important. This is the Tom, sorry, let me go back because I missed a good one. This is actually Algona, I'm sorry. This is Tom Wales' photo gallery, which is Centerville, Iowa. And to give you a short story, there's another historian named John Zeller, who's really the pioneer in much of this research. He found a probate record for a man named Pearson in Des Moines that told us every little item that he had in the studio, down to beakers and chemicals and everything. So this is the Coyle studio. This is in Muscatine, Iowa. And this is about 1880, but it's only one half of a stereograph. And I want you to notice the man in the upstairs window again, a place where they can lay their printing plates to expose them to the sun. And if you look under that stairwell, you're going to notice that there's a little wagon or cart there. That might have served as his portable darkroom, or maybe when he went out to take pictures of people. This is the J.M. Lentz photo gallery. If you read the signs, they say, cloudy weather, good sunshine. And this sign that's in the front, where you actually are seeing the back of the sign, that says gallery. And again, he probably has space up on the second floor, as well as this storefront where he's, again, advertising his wares. This is Guttenberg, Iowa. This is Chase, is the name of the photographer, as you can see there on the sign. And the Mississippi River is probably directly behind that. You can see in some of these photos that it's kind of a combination residence and studio for the photographer. This is Clarence, Iowa. This is called the DeKalb Studio. Interesting things, I always just like to read everything in these, and so you'll notice it says Millenarian Notions on that sign on the building next door. And you can also see this really interesting lamppost and what appears to be an outhouse back behind it. This is the J.P. Briggs Studio in Mitchell. This is a carte de visite. So right about, well, actually it starts in 1852, but we have thousands of photos of Civil War soldiers that were sent home to their loved ones, and those are mostly carte de visites, which are calling cards that are about 2 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. And they, as I mentioned earlier, they venture out of the studio, and there's a photo, another photo of the studio that shows there's a skylight that runs from the roof down to the ground, a 2-story skylight on the side of this building. This is the H.S. Mather Studio in Clear Lake, about 1880, again a combination home and residence. This is another one showing a little bit more primitive or maybe more a smaller village town setting, but again, I love the wooden sidewalk. I love everything about this picture. Now here's something interesting. If you look next to the building with the V stripes, you'll see there's kind of a little shed there. Well, that's a photography studio. And you can see the wares there are in frames, and you can also see the shelf that comes out of that area that, again, they can expose their plates on. I don't have a marker to show you, but I think you can figure that out. And here's another one of sort of a portable tent type studio that was just set up temporarily in a town. Once you got 200 people or 100 people in a town, and only a few of them can afford a photo, so you're not going to hang around too many days in a row. This is very conveniently located, as you'll notice the railroad depots in the background, so anybody making common walk through town is going to have a chance to pass by that business and maybe stop in. This is the Hammond Gallery, Hammond Picture Gallery. And again, look at the sawhorses out there holding up his picture frames of his wares. And this is the general primitiveness of that sort of shack, little cottage he's built, but added the little filigree woodwork and the iron at the top to make it look fancy. This is another one that just, I don't know all what's going on, but you see how gigantic that skylight is on the side of the building. They probably have a well boring equipment there next to that. And now we're going to talk about going out on the road. So they have to generate business. In the Stereograph study, we had 350 stereo photographers over about a 30-year period. And we found that they tended to follow the railroads. As the railroad got farther west, they'd stop and take photos, and then they'd get on the train and go on to the next town. But first they start out with wagons and buggies. And so if you can look way down at the very bottom of the photo, you see a wagon there that says photographer or photographer. I can't see it from here. And he's laid his hat up on top. But this is the kind of thing they do, is they drive around the countryside and stop and go and knock on a door and say, hey, I want to take a picture of your house, and you can share it and show everybody how prosperous you are. Or, what, you got a new horse I could take a picture of? I mean, they were looking for anything they could make money off of. This is Lauren Horton's Uncle Lance car, and this is a coup for Paul Jewell to collect this one, and because it's just so funny to see how they use the boards to balance it and keep it from tipping over. And again, look on the side where they've got a space where they can get more light into the side of it. This is why, because again, they're going to have a little place where they could lay their printing frames and expose their negatives to make prints. Oh, and let me go back to that one, because you can see even behind him is some gauze that suggests there's a skylight in the roof of that structure. And you can see down below the wheels. Sometimes I'd take an old railroad car and convert that. As a matter of fact, there's a letter between Wetherby in Iowa City and J.G. Evans of Muscatine, or they have a letter describing whether or not Wetherby wants to buy his photo car. And this is Robert Garnett in Montezuma, Iowa, and this is pretty complicated. He's out there trekking around in the winter months. He's got stovepipes there that suggest he's got stoves in there. Instantaneously, how exciting. This is so modern. And again, the wares are being displayed and the shelf on the outside for the printing, using the sun. He's probably got himself oriented directly towards the south. And here's an unusual one, Loess Fine Art Palace. And again, this may be pulled on next to a railroad depot or something with this long sidewalk, and that building on the right suggests to me that it's an ancillary studio of some sort, or maybe a shack where he's putting those toxic chemicals. I'm just going to really race through a lot of examples of 19th century photography of Iowa, and this is actually, again, one of the ward photos that we have. And this is the Musquaki, again, wonderful documentation of what their cattail mats look like, but also the fact that they've got government agents intruding into their lives. But Paul, tipping our hat again to Paul Jewell, he has spent, I've known him since at least 1985, and he's spent so much time scouring the universe for Iowa things, the most rare images we could imagine. This is the interior of a wickiup. That may be Agent Mallon or some other Indian agent on the left, but all of a sudden we have revealed quite a bit about life for the Musquaki. We can see a twine bag hanging in the background. I can see beadwork. I see a hand drill. I see a heddle that you would use for making beadwork. Of course, the kettle in the foreground. And just the whole presence that you sense from that environment in which they're living. And that's so that we can contrast that with what's going on elsewhere in Iowa. This is a farm family. This particular photograph is about 8 by 10, but it's mounted on a piece of linen. Somebody spent a lot of money on this, and it's probably late 1860s or at the latest. It's a very early photograph, very rare. And this is, again, the other one from Des Moines. This is giving you a sense that Iowa is at the crossroads of the nation. Not only do we have the Mississippi River as the main street of America, we have these Mormons trekking out west and defining what the route will be, and the gold seekers from Iowa City, of which there were many in 1849. So the path is coming through our state just like I-80 does now. And these are just examples of the density of that immigrant and movement that's going across our nation at that time. What I was referring to is, again, is coming to the west to find a new life. This is a carte de visite again. This is an example of where they're, at least in the 1860s, they're usually full-length portraits with rather small heads. By the 1870s, when we see portraits of University of Iowa students, they're usually just bust shots. So you start to see kind of an evolution in the way they present themselves. This is a tribute to Lowell Brandt, my friend, who was the warden at Oakdale. This is Fort Madison Penitentiary, and this is about 1860. And this is a carte de visite as well. This is only, again, a very tiny little card, but very sharp lenses to yield all this detail. Now, you could interpret this photo any way you want, but they're holding on to the shoulder of the man in front of them. That's a way to keep everybody in order. And if you had a magnifier, I think I'm not wrong to say the men in the background actually must be getting ready for a shower or delousing because they're actually all naked. This is just to show you Iowa's, we're a boomtown city here in this state at the beginning of photography and for the next 50 years. So this is a lumber yard. Let me see if I remember. If you give me a second here. I don't actually know. This is about 1870, but I've forgotten the town. But it's a common experience across Iowa. And just everything you can figure out what's going on in there. There's probably a road or a railroad on the far right side, and just some very interesting construction going on. This is a tribute to my friend Ron Rowland. This is Eddyville, when it was the center of the universe. And so this is, again, about an 1870 or possibly earlier shot. And my friends know I love these shots that show the horizon and what's going on with the countryside surrounding the town. I love to see that unending horizon line. But I also like to peek into these fenced-in yards and look for the outhouses and see whether they've got a nice garden going or whether they have anything modern. This town is waiting for excitement to come. Now, this is Missouri Valley. This is more my neck of the woods, although I usually avoid going that way. I'm a little farther north. But this stereograph is really remarkable for a number of reasons, not just because it's my home turf. You can see so many details of what it's like to settle on that landscape. And I'm going to give you a blow up here because I'm a Loess Hills fan. And here we can see the kind of erosion that's going on. We can see the steepness of those hills. The perspective of the photographer has given me a sense of how high they are. And by magnifying, all of a sudden I'm seeing this laundry, this woman's laundry hanging out on the line. And I'm seeing this bringing of civilization to the west with these orderly sidewalks and fences and leading up to the house, everything set in a uniform, symmetrical way. But any of you who drive western Iowa or drive the Loess Hills, I'm just excited to see this very first road following along the base of those hills, a road that probably has been paved over in many ways over now, but it still tells me in my imagination what that might have been like. Now, stereographs, that was really a whole new world. When you can see things in a 3-dimension and magnified, you really can step into the reality of the past. And so I would encourage you to look at the book that Paul and I did. Paul has amassed a collection of over 3,000 stereographs of Iowa. It's just a magnificent collection. But this is one that is created by D.C. Hale, DeWitt Clinton Hale, who lived in Alcater, Iowa. He actually lost an arm, I believe, in the Civil War. But this is a street scene, but this is his glass plate negative, a print from it that shows how he would organize the space and trim that down later for mounting on a card. And this is very rare to have a wet plate negative and to have this example of how he made the stereograph. Believe me, there's nothing else in American history that I'm aware of that shows this technique. And here's a close-up of it. And all of a sudden I talked about getting inside the picture. Well, get inside that circle of people because they've got really unusual and early brass instruments in their hands. And you can see a whole lot of other details in that photo. So stereographs are amazing. So can anybody figure out where this is taken? Well, it's coming in Dubuque Street. So this is the Terrell Mill and all that devastation that's been going on to that natural environment and the limestone bluffs. This is the way it looked to the people who came to Iowa City in the first place. So you can see, again, the river's right there, but the river was a wide river. Why we didn't respect it, I don't know. This is old brick at a time when it had a steeple on it. This is the Pinney House, which was up on South Clinton Street, probably about where that new hotel with the view restaurant is. And the reason I included this is because this is more than likely the place that Mark Twain walked by when he came to town in 1868. And this is a famous photographer named Hamilton and Hoyt who was active in Sioux City. And these are Winnebago women who came into his studio and were posed in this particular way. This is just an example of, this would look really cool if it were in a stereo viewer and you could see it pop. But one of the things that we did was we partnered with Old Capitol here because downstairs is a kiosk about children's diaries, and they used many of our diaries from our collection. And one day the student had been reading a diary and she came in, I need some visuals to go with this. We want to get the kids excited. She said, I'm looking for something with a slumber party in it. I said, get real. Who do you think? You think I'm going to find you an 1875 photo of a slumber party? Guess what? Paul found one. So this is something that, again, just to show you how these can be used to get people excited about the past and to remind them that their lives as teenagers or young people are not that different than those that lived 150 years ago. Of course, paramount our growth was the railroad. Across the state, we had more density of railroad line than almost any other nation in the state because we needed all these farm-to-market venues to get our crops out to the world. This is a very early locomotive. We have hundreds of photos of locomotives and depots. Again, Jamie Baranek is one of our experts in this area who helps to classify those and get them in the right place. This is one of those mystery photos. I challenge any of you to tell me what you think is going on. I think that those are grain barges and that those little huts are places they could put wheat or grain and keep it dry as they traveled down the Mississippi River with this barge. So this is Musquaki, Iowa, and we know it's a Mississippi River, but we've lost the connection back to the memory of what this actually shows. We can only speculate now. We know there were vast lumber rafts going by that town, but something else is going on with these pictures. So this kind of discovery, again made by Paul Jewell, is really integral to us having a full portrait of our state. And this is another one that's remarkable. This is Vinton, Iowa. And right away, my eyes are drawn to all the belts that are connected overhead to a steam-operated machinery. And so this is a whole new industrial revolution going on, and not everybody in Iowa is a farmer. And so these kinds of pictures do a great job of reminding us of that. But in your mind, I want you to think about those clacking belts and that noise and the smell of oil and grease and the warmth of the steam in the summer. There's a lot of inferences you could derive if you start thinking about an image and what it shows you. This is Cedar Rapids, and this is, I think, the cereal company fire, correct, Paul? And what I want you to really notice here is all that worker housing in the foreground. Not everybody's living in a Victorian mansion. This is them living in rather close quarters to the place they can walk to work from. And this, I'm moving into some of the technological changes. After the stereograph, which was actually set to be about 3 by 3 inches, roughly speaking, we have amateurs and other commercial photographers starting to use larger format glass plate negatives. So this is West Mitchell, Iowa, and this is called a boudoir print, because this print actually is quite large. It measures about 7 by 9 inches, I believe, would be about the right way to say that. And compare that to that little carte de visite I just told you about, which was only 2 by 4 inches or so. Again, looking out into the distance, what the landscape was like, how this thing grew up. If someone was in the field of historic preservation or they were a highway engineer, they would love to find that photo that shows those brick bridge abutments and the way this was constructed. And I doubt this bridge is still here, but I can tell you other bridges in Iowa, like Rockford, Iowa, are being preserved because they can benefit from looking at photographs that document it. Now, this is 2 examples, and I wanted to thank Mary Noble here tonight. Mary Noble has worked religiously to document the work of Iowa women photographers. I looked back at my notes, and some of the data that came together was something like 5.7% of these 19th century photographers were women. So these are the Mrs. Parsons and Bates who created this image. And this is a mill up by Iowa Falls that actually Timothy Townsend from Iowa City also photographed. It was a landmark location, and it actually showed us, again, the reliance on the water power to carry out much of the activities. And this is another Mrs. Parsons and Bates image. And this is just so much fun with the guy with the bicycle and the woman with her bicycle. And these women out there, you know, they're going to row that boat. They don't need any guys around. They're going to take their kids out for a little jaunt on the water. And this is another thing. When I was practicing this talk, Bob said, gosh, you keep mentioning Paul Jewell. But I have to keep mentioning Paul Jewell. And I have to mention Mary Noble again, because a lot of this work that we've done together is based on friendship. And so Mary brought to Paul's attention when he had gathered one of these cards that, what are the merchants' carnivals about? Why do these people dress up in this garb? And Paul has like maybe, 35, 40 examples where they would have a parade in town for all the merchants. And if you were the meat shop, the lady would have sausages hanging down from her dress and be carrying a ham. And if you were the milliner, you'd have ribbons and feathers and all kinds of accoutrements. So they would actually the movie Maverick with James Garner has a photographer person in a merchant parade, so you might watch that sometime. But anyway, they've got dollar bills and coins and everything connected to her. So this is just local stuff. This is probably a Norwegian immigrant girl who's serving as a hired hand in the Marsh household up in Decorah. But again, gives us a chance to see women's activities. An activity that is, it's happening in the backyard. Who's going to bring a camera back there? This is probably more of an amateur shot that someone in the family took. And then we have things like the threshing crews in Iowa that really were a time of community when large people gathered together, and so sometimes a crew would come out, a commercial photographer, just to photograph them. And then we have Dr. Love and his family. They were here in Iowa City. And this is just a classic portrayal of Victorian life with all the conflicting, very, very busy patterns of wallpaper and Persian rugs. But the kids are playing with blocks just like they would now, and the family dog's sitting there, and everybody seems to be proud of who they are. This is the Schwinn family. The guy with the mustache seated on the ground, that's Leonard Schwinn. He lived in Red Oak, Iowa, and he sold shoes for a living. But he got a camera, and he got some 8x10 glass plate negatives to use with that camera. and made these incredibly detailed shots of his community, including interiors of classrooms that you can just literally walk into in your mind. This is a nutting party. But he really gave us a nice portrait of Southwest Iowa in the 1890s. And this is the Mather family. They came to Iowa as Quakers from Ohio in 1850, and they lived out near Springdale in Cedar County, and they left an incredible historical record of letters and diaries and photographs. They actually created pictorial histories on their family, and this is one page out of that. Nan Wolverton Franklin did her PhD on the Mather family, and many other scholars could come in and look at that family. But that little package on the left, that's actually a piece of upholstery cloth from the sofa up there above where her parents were married in front of it. And this room is where they had all their children except Rachel. And who knows why there's an article about Clark Gable making a movie. That's totally not, but that's what that little newspaper clipping is about. And this is a member of the Mather family. Jeanette Mather married a man named Lord. So this is Frederick Lord with his toys, toy soldiers. And this one, I just can't escape the beauty of it. And if you looked at this in 3D, you would just go, wow. And this is an amateur stereo maker, 1903, up in Elbert City, Iowa. And it's just absolutely stunning to look at that in a 3D. Now, not every photo's in focus. You can't even reproduce it, really, but it's full of information. We can see there's a Wapsie Valley Fair. We can see they had acrobats. It doesn't matter. I mean, these aren't the primo ones that we're after, but nonetheless, if they fall into our lap, we're not going to deny them because they still teach us things. This is the Baranek and Son livery stable up in Solon. This is actually relatives of Jamie Baranek. And this building still stands. They use it for wedding venues up there. You probably drive by it and don't even realize that that was its original use. And this just represents photographic postcards because I don't have time to show you very many of them today, and they number in the thousands. And people like Jamie have been private collectors of them and then shared them with the State Historical Society. And again, this is something you wouldn't expect to see, but maybe some doctor just took his little 4x5 camera into surgery that day. This is actually Waverly, Iowa. And then I don't know if Roger Duffy's here tonight, but this is a panoramic view from the west side of the campus. And the reason I included this, I'm going to show you a close-up in a minute, is you can see a lot about change in Iowa City. Right smack in the middle is about where the Iowa Memorial Union is. But what really disturbs me, that's just me personally, is if I stood in that space now, all I would see is a lot of high-rise buildings conflicting with the beauty of the old Capitol Gold Dome. But this is a close-up of that scene. So all these houses in the foreground where some of his relatives lived are now gone. But you can get a sense of, again, how much the university transforms the town. And you could spend hours, again, with a magnifying glass looking at different aspects of this. This is probably about 1913. And another panorama we have, this is the Musquaki powwow. And they had an arbor over their drummers for shade. And it's kind of difficult to see some of the details, but it's just, again, a pretty amazing photograph from my point of view. And now I'm going to take some time, and this is not going to last forever, talking about some of the individual photographers that we have collections from, and this is sort of a chronological approach. So D.C. Hale is up in Elkader, as I mentioned earlier. This is one of his shots that, again, shows I believe it's the Turkey River running through town and some of the early building that's going on. We really see these towns in their infancy or when they're really just taking off. This is a store, and you can notice those are wooden wheelbarrows in the foreground. And this is a farm with Holstein cattle as well as other livestock that they're promoting. But I'm going to jump quickly to Bertha Shambaugh, and I won't digress too much, but she's probably the reason I do this. This is Bertha Shambaugh. She got her camera in 1889 when she graduated from high school. Now, she wasn't very tall, maybe 5'2". And that camera was heavy and had glass plate negatives that she had to lug around in a box along with her. And she had many claims to fame, besides marrying Benjamin Shambaugh. This is when she's still a young girl named Bertha Maud Horak. And this is her home over at 120 Dodge. The home is still standing. And this is, again, just like the Mrs. Parsons and Bates, this is a chance for middle-class young ladies to get involved in the practice of photography and to stamp their work to show they're very serious artistes as they do this. But for us, it documents her home. This is another Shambaugh photo. This is where she really got her claim to fame. She first did a study of labor out in Amana for the Iowa Department of Labor, and then she went out there with her camera. And at that time, Amana didn't believe in photography. They thought it was an exercise in vanity. But she could, she would take the train out to Homestead, and she could communicate with the person out there who was deaf. And she made friends with them, so they kind of let her into their world, including the church archives. So this is a view of Amana. This is one that she really got famous for. But what happened was it got cropped, and the woman on the left with the child was called the knitting lesson. And so we don't often see what the actual photograph looked like. And then there's Peter Hanley, who came to me as an intern from Cornell College many years ago, and he is the expert on Amana history. He came to me and he said, you know what, I've got some of Bertha's glass plate negatives. She gave them to my grandfather. And so all of a sudden, besides the 100 or more that we had, and Joan Liffrin Zug has reprinted her book and used many of those images, we all of a sudden we had some new ones. So this shows the dredge boat that's used to clean the Amanas. Now, Frank Foster, he deserves a book unto himself, maybe when I retire. He lived up in Iowa Falls, Iowa, and he created a perfect portrait of American family life around 1900. So you can see I've moved up through time now. I'm just turned the century now. So this is a taffy puller at a local fair, something you don't see very often, and then you start thinking about the dirt and the dust and would I really want to eat that stuff? These are important images for many, many reasons. We have over 686 4x5 glass plate negatives from Mr. Foster. He later got interested in moving images, so we actually have some of his home movies as well. But they were so amazing, we said, we're not capturing the essence or the beauty of these using modern photographic processes. We couldn't get the right kind of paper to show all the nuances of those images. So a woman named Amy Lilienfeld, a very well-trained photographer, we got some printing out paper so that we could replicate the process much closer to the one that was used by the original photographer. A different kind of chemistry, more like the sun prints that even Wetherby was making back in the 1850s. So what that reveals to us is we can see the soapy milk on the top of her bucket there as she does laundry, and you can see the calico pattern on her dress and her apron. But beyond the details is the fact that this shows women in ordinary dress doing everyday activities. They're not dressed in their fancy, I'm going to church or I'm going to the photography studio. They're wearing their aprons and their smocks, and they haven't maybe combed their hair in a while. So again, this is reality hitting you in the face. Another really intimate, private view that we can get when we have amateur photographers is this one. Now, if you look at that carefully, you'll see she has a curling iron stuck in the top of that kerosene lantern. And you can see how long her hair is beneath her waist, and she's trying to figure out how to do her personal adornment here. We just simply do not see these. This is like one of a kind out of the millions of images I've seen. And this is another one. And obviously posed or a joke, but when do you see a man in his nightshirt and his socks like that? You just don't. He looks a little funny. But the other parts of the community that Foster documented are what teach us the lessons of history. This is a time when the Industrial Revolution and shoe factories are displacing the artist and shoemaker who maybe had a cottage or a home-based industry. So all those molds that you see on the shelf, those wooden molds, those are individually customized to each of his customers. And so we're getting a chance to see what small-town Iowa was like if you stopped in one of these stores. And again, there's many, many more photos than I can show you. And I just like the sentiment of this. This is some boys in their sled on Simplot Hill. But I think this is really a work of art. When I look at the way that snow is packed down and it captures what I see every day in Iowa in the winter, that's just beautiful. So we'll go to Mary Edith Clark. We're moving in time up to about 1910. We got a bunch of photos in the mail, and we didn't know what any of them were. They just said embossed on the postcard was E.M. Clark. But one guy was photographed, had a name. The name was Broot, B-R-O-O-T. So I had a creative student who wrote a letter to the donor, somehow wrote a letter out to Oregon and said, does anybody know who the Broot family is? And the guy writes back, he goes, yeah, that's my mother. And here we'd been assuming all along this was a male photographer. And so Edith Mary Clark, this is actually my alter ego, is this little boy and his dog. I just love this photograph. I actually wanted this to be on the cover of an Iowa album because it's the immediacy of the moment. That dog and the joy that that kid is having with his friend, I just love it. This is Edith Mary Clark. She was an outdoors woman. She went hunting, she fished, she was not afraid to hang out with men. You'll see that in these pictures. This is her with her camera. A little bit more compact than what Bertha Shambaugh had to carry around, but still a tripod. And she would travel around in a buggy to go to her different places. She was kind of the community photographer of Lost Island Lake, which is a very small community. Now this is another one that I think approaches very high artistic sensibilities and standards. If you didn't know it, there was a lot of commercial fishing going on in the Great Lakes, including Lost Island Lake, and then that was shipped by rail over to markets in Chicago. So these are great big seining nets that were used on the lakes, probably Lost Island Lake. And these men here are going out for, I think, a catfish catch. But her sense of composition, the way your eye is drawn through the image, and the fact that she's in there with those men, she's not standing back 20 feet, she's right there next to them. And this, again, a very picturesque pastoral scene that I think is reminiscent of the beauty of Iowa. And here's a tug of war. We read about tug of war, we hear about it, but now we're seeing these guys playing it. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit. She had 6 kids, and she adopted or was a foster mother to another 6 kids. And so she had a very playful imagination. So this is a bandit, and this is the little policeman driving his go-kart. And there he catches the thief. And now he's going to visit the fortune teller tent. So you can just imagine her having fun with these kids every day, playing around. And she had another series that are of her little kitten inside a little tin jar, or she takes her collie dog and puts a little thing on his head, and a bottle of medicine, and he's sick. And she just creates these little stories, I think, to entertain these kids. And so this is Frances Edith Babcock. She's a neighbor girl. And the reason this one's rare is because somebody doing washing dishes. Again, I can tell you, I can't, 2 hands would sum total of how many pictures we have of people in the kitchen washing dishes. But what's really important about Edith Mary Clark, this is a black performance group up in Ruthven, Iowa. Who would guess that they would come up there and entertain that community? But very scarce evidence of the presence of African Americans in Iowa in this time period. And this is one of them, just because she's out there with her camera. Fred Kent, oh, I could talk all day about Fred Kent. He grew up in DeWitt, Iowa. He started photography when he was 12 years old because his dad had a drugstore. He became the official University of Iowa photographer in 1914 or thereabouts. He had an office over in McLean originally. He was friends with James Van Allen, and together they figured out the university should really make him the official photographer. This, if you don't know what it is, it's the Amana fish trap. This is no longer visible out on the Iowa River because it's under silt from flooding and things. I've been out on that fish trap. But this is a prehistoric fish trap that the archaeologists have studied, but one of the key pieces of documentation they turn to is Fred Kent's photograph. And this is a color stereo slide. Again, Fred Kent revitalized the stereo views in the 1920s with black and white views of his family and the university. And then in 1945 or so, he got a color stereo camera. And he used to carry that camera on his hat and go around and take pictures. And so we have 8,536 of his color stereo views. And they're Kodachrome, they retain their color. They're just fantastic. And again, if you had this 3D, you'd again be going, wow. So this is Fred with his camera, about the time he started his career here. He really was an artist. I can't emphasize enough how compelling his images are. He was involved with Dr. Ponsetti here filming procedures. He was over in the medical college helping them document diseases and pathology. He was one of the pioneers in microscopic photography so that he could work with people to identify diseases. I mean, this man is really an American legend. He went off in World War I and learned aerial photography. He tested early versions of color film for Kodak. I wrote an article about him for our magazine, but I actually, in the background, was always working on a book about him because he truly deserves more recognition. And in this community, we need to celebrate him as much as possible. This is just in here because of the weather. This is people skating here in Iowa City. That's the Park Road Bridge you see there in the distance. And this is one of those stereos that I wish you could see it in 3D because these people come to life. You can't see it here, but there's a tear on that guy's work shirt on the shoulder. The mud on the tractors. This doesn't really do this image justice, but it's beautiful. And then he had such a knack for the landscape and for Iowa's natural beauty. I used to have this one as a screensaver on my computer. And this is City Park, the carousel at City Park. Again, documenting that era, the late 1940s, the early 1950s in this case. I'm going to jump in time back to the 1930s. We have 5,000 photographs, black and white, taken by professional photographers that show the wide range of WPA activities in Iowa. This is Eagle Point Park up in Dubuque. If you haven't gone there, you should. It's really one of the most distinguished parts of Iowa, the way it's built into the landscape there, even if it sadly has deteriorated. This is Sioux City, where they're rechanneling the Floyd River because it constantly floods. And that's the Gordon Drive Viaduct overhead there. Just to show the amount of manpower, the fact that things are still being done by hand with shovels and wheelbarrows and not very mechanized at all. And these are library workers in Des Moines, another group of WPA workers, only to emphasize that this documents adult literacy classes, it shows farm to market roads, it shows high school stadiums and municipal swimming pools under construction. Again, a whole period of transformation in Iowa history. Pete Weddick, I got to race through these, but he was a Mount Pleasant man who originally worked for the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, not as a photographer, but as a person helping tenant farmers acquire land. And he documents, again, agricultural life in Iowa when modern amenities are being introduced for the first time. So here we have a potbelly stove. But this is Weddick with his camera. Again, the reason I sought, my whole career has been about seeking large format photography that yields great details and it has enough quality behind it from these professional photographers that they can be used for a variety of purposes. Whoops, sorry. This is the Middleshort family. This got a lot of play a few years ago because Christy Vilsack is from Mount Pleasant, so there was a special exhibit at Terrace Hill. The UI Art Museum did a special exhibit, which is currently on display at the Hoover Library. And Iowa Public Television did a documentary about this called People in the Pictures, where they tracked down these people and interviewed them. The lady ended up in the Iowa legislature, and the children are still alive. This is what I was talking about earlier about the vast amount of documentation. Just like you compile lots of scientific specimens to conduct research, you have to have lots of photographic specimens. And I just like this guy's attitude. This is the beauty Weddick was able to capture. And he had pictures all the time in Wallace's Farmer, Successful Farming, Encyclopedia Britannica. And this is the last one I'll show you of his, but it's a bygone era that he's documenting with this shocking of the oats, putting that last shock on top to keep the rain off of the rest of it. And I'll bridge quickly to Don Alting. He's a journalist. This is the same subject matter, though. You see how these patterns can be traced through time because these photographers are bringing their cameras to focus on the same thing. The sense of movement, the beauty in this, the sky, I love this picture. But Don Alting, he won a Pulitzer Prize. Not very many photographers are going to win Pulitzer Prize because he was a journalist who shot this on movie film. This is a Drake player named Johnny Bright. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, he was being slugged even though the play was going on elsewhere. And this won Alting a Pulitzer Prize. Showing racism here in the Midwest in the athletics. This is Don. He was a character. I love Don. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. And the only reason I knew Don is because Joan Liffrin Zug introduced us. I could tell you there's a continuous thread throughout this talk if you didn't realize it. Because Isaac Wetherby photographed Timothy Townsend. And Fred Kent would go in and light the stove for Timothy Townsend. And Bertha Shambaugh knew Fred Kent, and Fred Kent knew Joan, and Joan, everybody on this thread is connected, not just because of me, but because they love photography. Really important image, again, lacking full documentation of blacks in Iowa. Here's some jitterbug dancers in Des Moines in the 1940s. Don was unusual because the Des Moines Register was a statewide newspaper that wanted to have this coverage of every corner of the state. So they had a plane called the Good News. And they set Don up every morning to go get a story somewhere. So he had this incredible mobility. And this is just one example of the kind of image he created. So again, what kind of a perspective do we have on our state? After we had even the 92, 93 floods, I saw a satellite view of Iowa that showed how the Mississippi River and the Iowa and the Cedar and everything had backed up into its old creeks and things. And the knowledge that came from that satellite image totally changed the way I look at the world. Now this picture also does that for me. And I was looking for that picture because I knew it was beautiful, and I ran into this one. I had to throw it in. This is Sioux City. But what's key to this is showing you before I-29 has been built along that side, that river. Those dunes you see in the northwest corner of that picture, they're all housing developments in suburbia now. And I can even pick out where my grandmother's house is in this picture. But way that little thread of river you see, that's the Big Sioux River forming the border of Iowa. So you're seeing Nebraska, South Dakota, and Iowa in that picture. But this is the artist in the photographer. And this is a parallel story to what I'm going to tell about Joan. They sent Alting up to North Dakota, right where Standing Rock was. This is Sitting Bull's grave, and they wanted him to cover that story. So he went that day and took some kind of formula shots, and then he just kind of hung around, just quietly observed the scene. And after a while, the family kind of started walking up from the river and from the gravesite, and that was the golden moment that he clicked the camera. So to me, this just has a lot of emotion behind it, and it's history, and an Iowan captured it. Press Citizen, I got to race through these, but we have the negatives from the Press Citizen from about 1940 to 1970. This is a 1952 campaign worker. I laugh at this one. I couldn't show it, but Joan has a really funny one of some Goldwater supporters that it reminds me of. This is, if you can't figure it out, James Van Allen. And then there's topics like student unrest. So this is Dubuque Street. And just for a second, pay attention to that Morrison sign, that lit sign up there. The Morrison building was on the corner where the Black Hawk Mini Park is. And when you look at that ambrotype in the case in the Faces of Iowa exhibit, that's the building that stood there that you see that sign on. So that was torn down in urban renewal, but it's still there in 1970. The labor collection, oh, I don't even have my watch out, so if you need to leave, go ahead and go. The Iowa Labor Collection started out as a collection of over 1,000 oral histories with Iowa workers with 75 occupational groups in 15 urban areas of Iowa. But we still had lacking some information. This is actually a woman, a Hispanic woman down in Fort Madison where they recruited workers for the Santa Fe Railroad. We couldn't find them on the census records because they're living in boxcars. So she's actually standing in front of her home. This is the Ducey family. They're a coal mining family. This is their shack, no modern amenities, no running water, no outhouse. He talks in the oral history how they would just hold him over the edge of the house if he had to pee. And this is Lehi, Iowa. And again, you see the whole row of miner shacks up there right next to the tipple. And this is the West Burlington Railroad Shop, the shop colony for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. We moved up a little bit in time. Not very many of them own cars. But you can see they're basically living in tar paper shacks. There's a housing shortage going on. And these are workers on the railroad up in Mason City. And we have this because there was a man named William Quinones who served in World War II, and he lost his life. So his family gave me all the letters he wrote, or gave us all the letters he wrote. And this photograph was tucked in there. And so these are railroad workers, probably in the late 1930s. And I had to throw this in because you had a huge demonstration at the state capitol for women a year ago. Well, this is 1947, and I would argue the size of this crowd rivals the size of that crowd. And these are Iowa Union people protesting the right to work law conflict that they were having with Governor Blue. And this is Mason City. I have to give credit to Janet Weaver, the Iowa Women's Archives, because she went the extra step and found the daughters of these women and came back with the names of who's in this picture. So being able to add names and dates and information is what adds value to these. These are just a couple of joyous shots. This is the Quad Cities, the Farm Equipment United Electrical Workers against International Harvester Company trying to get a fair deal. And these are the farm all workers also doing that. And then this is an example of a photo. The lady in the center, we fight today for a better tomorrow. We actually made a life-size figure for her for a museum exhibit once, but it was nice to base it on something that was authentic. And this, again, is an example, almost accidental. I ended up finding an entire newspaper article about this guy. His name is Vernon Wilkerson. And there was a Russian delegation coming to Iowa. It wasn't the famous Garst delegation, it was a different one. And he had been refused a drink at a tavern in Keokuk. And he was a returning war veteran. And he got pissed off. And he said, I'm going to go to this event where there's all this media coverage, and I'm going to stand there with my sign. And there we go. A last shot of workers. This is the Scheller Globe plant here in Iowa City. But again, gives you a sense of the day-to-day work environment that woman was working in. Oh, and Joan, here we are today. Joan will be 89 here in a week, and we'll have her stand up here in a minute. But this is continuing our labor story. This is a John Deere worker. A lot of hand skill going on for his job. And this is Joan with her camera. There's lots of cool pictures of Joan with her camera, including one where she's in an experimental aircraft. But what Joan did, to parallel back to what Altang did, there were a group of workers in Muscatine that were picking tomatoes for the Heinz Company, and there was a lot of concern about unfair housing, the children in the schools, a lot of things going on. So the Muscatine Migrant Commission was formed. The local community leaders, church leaders tried to do something about the inequality. Joan went down as a journalist to photograph it. She got some good shots, but she went back and something was funky with her camera, and so she said, I got to go do that again. And lucky for her, she got to see some things, and I can't even show one because it shows a corn crib being used as basically a wash shed or an outhouse. But this, to me, personifies a classic universal image that's literally timeless and shows the situation this woman is in, and yet there she is caring for her child. I'm not sure if Joan calls this Madonna and Child, but it certainly qualifies as that. I think it's Migrant Mother and Child is the official name of it. And this is the daughter of Joan's housekeeper, and Joan captured this moment to remind us that she lived in a divided world. You can maybe not see the broken glass in the window pane, but. And this is a truly landmark photograph. The Getty did a book last year called North of Dixie, and they wanted 2 photos from every state. And the first photo they chose was the Vernon Wilkerson holding his sign about how narrow-minded we are. And the second photo they chose was this one. And it stands out because Martin Luther King Jr.'s hands are visible. And he was very expressive when he talked, but most of the time he was behind a podium. So this photograph reveals quite a bit about him. And even the other day when I saw Obama's portrait, I thought, oh, he's got his hands in front of him. But I just love the drama of this and point out that it's truly, again, an American photograph of note. And this lady cracks me up. She's in Newburgh, Iowa. She just got a new TV. She's so excited, but she's kind of trapped in her old world too, the way she designs her house or her shoes and her stockings. I think I have this right, but there's a young musical artist named James Whitmore Elliott, and he chose this photograph to be the cover of his album when he released it a few years ago. And Joan, again, she went into lives that many of us wouldn't. She was very supportive of equal housing in Cedar Rapids. This is Cecil Reed. He was the first Republican in the state legislature. And she's got some views of the interior of his home that just fool you, because here's this very stable middle-class home full of books and intelligence being conveyed by what's present in that room. I think Mark mentioned that he just dissected everything in that room. So this is, again, very important. The UI Press did a book about this man. But she captures pop culture, this young teenager, that says Johnny Mathis on that album, and she's got pictures of Ricky Nelson and Elvis on the wall behind her. And Joan went out as a portrait photographer to people's homes, more affluent homes than not. And I'm using this picture because I want to contrast it. You can see these kids are, I guess, playing like they have a fort maybe, and they're wearing fake war bonnets. But they're having a good time. But if this is Iowa in 1965, or the fantasy, the Disneyland version of it, here's the reality of it. This is George Youngbear's home out at the Musquaki settlement. Again, no running water. I'm not sure whether they had electricity at that time. Even though REC was available, most of Musquaki couldn't afford to get the connection between the line and their house. And so this is, again, a representation of what their life was truly like. And here's cooking over a fire. So I'll end with David Luck. He was a Daily Iowan journalist, photographer, and he recorded things about student unrest that other people didn't. This is a very angry police officer spraying mace on someone. I want to end with Peter Feldstein. We lost Peter last December. I could start crying right here about him. I met him in 1966 because his wife was roommates with my older sister. This is his studio out in Oxford, and it's really the end of an era because he was very well schooled in traditional methods as a photographer, all the chemistry and things like that, very precision oriented. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I know you're eager to go, but he did this landmark study called the Oxford Project. And this is captures an entire community, both in 1984 and again in 2004. But he also was commissioned by the College of Public Health in 2013, to create life-size portraits on panels of glass. So go over to the College of Public Health and view those. This is Kaylin Rowland, again, Ron's granddaughter, because I made a list of people I knew around the state so Peter could go and track them down and try to get a diverse representation of who lives in our state. So I'll end with this one. This is Alex Walker. He's a Musquaki man again, a Musquaki leader. And this is one of Peter's panels. These were actually, I think, about 12 or 15,000 a piece, and they were made in Germany. So that's the end of the era for me. And this is where I sit at the same desk these ladies sit at. This is Schaefer Hall when the State Historical Society of Iowa was located there. And so my tenure there is ending, and I won't belabor the point, but I'm passing the torch to you. You've now discovered what an incredible photographic legacy we've assembled, and I encourage you to really come and enjoy it. There's one more goofy photo, and then I'll stop. I hope the next person that comes along has a wild imagination, a keen memory, and is about as nutty as this lady is about details. Because if you're going to amass a collection, you've got to stick with it for the long term to really create something important. I wanted to just ask a few people in the room here, if you will bear with me. Eric Lana, would you please stand? Jamie Baranek, Paul Jewell, Joan Liffrin Zug, Mary Noble, Andrea Truitt, Ernie Reardon, Charles Scott. I don't know who else might be here, but I want to emphasize the point that these are the people who deserve the round of applause. They go into the trenches with me and they do the work. And it's very labor intensive. It really requires a quick mind and attentiveness to detail. So let's give them a round of applause instead of me. Thank you for inviting me.